We're joined by Jonathan Dagher. He's head of the Middle East desk at Reporters Without Borders. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, Jonathan. Firstly, more than 100 journalists have been killed in Gaza since the start of the war. Many more have lost family members, they've lost their homes. Those who are still there are working under nearly impossible conditions. Just take us through some of the challenges, if you will.
Good morning. Yes, as you mentioned, the situation in Gaza for journalists is extremely dangerous. It remains extremely dangerous. More than 100 journalists have been killed by Israeli forces in Gaza since October 7, of whom at least 22 were killed while working or in the context of doing their work. Those who remain today find themselves in extremely dire conditions. Many are incapable of working. Already we have black holes of information throughout Gaza, especially in the north. Most journalists are in the south. They're in Rafah. They are stuck because the borders with Egypt are closed. Very few have been able to come out. There is a complete destruction of infrastructure. Media offices destroyed. Journalists' homes are destroyed. No internet access. I mean, very little internet access, intermittent power cuts, a lack of material and resources. So in light of all of these conditions, and of course, we need to mention that the journalists are exhausted, they're tired. They've been covering this for 7 months. They've had to cover the deaths of their family members, of their colleagues, of people they know, of other civilians. And today we're finding that there's been very little has been done in order to protect these journalists in Gaza. In fact, all of the mechanisms that were meant to protect these journalists have so far failed to do so because the massacre continues. And this is a direct reflection of political pressures on an international level that prevents the enacting. It shows a lack of political will to enact the laws that protect journalists, namely UN resolutions and international law. Today, we're calling on governments internationally to mount the pressure on Israel so that this massacre stops and that the journalists can continue to work freely and safely in Gaza.
And Jonathan, the International Criminal Court, it's been including crimes against journalists, alleged crimes against journalists, in its investigations. Reporters Without Borders, you say that Israel is still not being held accountable for what's happening in Gaza. Just give us some examples, if you will, please.
Well, since October 7 only, RSF has filed 2 complaints to the International Criminal Court for war crimes committed against journalists in Gaza. These concern journalists where we've been able to verify that the journalists were targeted, that they were clearly identifiable, that they were killed while they were working. We're calling on the court to investigate these claims and to hold Israel to account because, unfortunately, impunity for crimes committed against journalists by Israel, it did not start on October 7. We can go back to Shireen Abu Akleh or even further back to other journalists. 3 journalists have been killed in the south of Lebanon, also by Israeli forces. Aysam Abdullah, Farah Omar, Rabia Mameri, and 6 investigations, including one by RSF, have proven that Aysam Abdullah from Reuters was intentionally targeted with the group of journalists he was working with, even though they were all clearly identifiable, and that the targeting was by Israeli weaponry. In light of all these investigations, there is no excuse for justice not to be pursued and held, and for the authors of the crimes against journalists to be held to account. This impunity permits further crimes against journalists. This impunity endangers not just journalists, but the right of the public everywhere to having free, independent, and pluralistic information, particularly from war zones.
And Jonathan, many journalists have been forced to leave Gaza, understandably, given the conditions that they're living and working in. Why do those who remain feel that it is their duty to stay in Gaza and continue to work despite the near impossible conditions that they're faced with?
You know, journalists in Gaza have always been motivated by the sense of duty. We went to Doha to meet some of the journalists who have been evacuated, including RSF's correspondent Ala Zanoun and Chief Bureau of Al Jazeera's chief correspondent, Wael al-Dahdouh, as well as journalists from AFP and independent journalists. And they all told us that despite the risk, despite the dangers and the difficulties, they felt they had a duty to show the world what was happening in their country. And this is why they keep doing what they do now. A lot of journalists continue to do that despite the difficulty. They believe it is their duty. They know that they are our eyes and ears on the ground. They know that without them, we would have no other source of verifiable and reliable information. And so they keep doing this. It's also important to note that some journalists perhaps need to leave. They need to evacuate at least their family members, but are incapable of doing so because the borders with Egypt are completely closed. They need the authorization of several states, including the Israeli authorities. It's very difficult for them to leave. And just as importantly, if not more, the international community of journalists, international journalists are not allowed into Gaza, and that is completely unacceptable. Israeli authorities have banned international journalists from coming in through Rafah with Egyptian complicity, of course. So far, the only journalists who have been able to come in went in as embedded with the Israeli forces from the north. Restricted, and they were submitted to strict restrictions and censorship by the Israeli military. I believe there have been 1 or 2 exceptions where journalists were able to come in independently from Rafah, but they are really are exceptions, and this has not been something that other journalists were able to do despite them trying.
And what kind of consequences, Jonathan, is this having on what we're actually seeing reported from Gaza?
Well, clearly what we're witnessing is a clear attempt on behalf of Israeli authorities to impose a media blackout on the war in Gaza, whether it is by the violence of killing journalists and their family members or destroying their homes and their media offices, the cutoff of infrastructure, cutting off internet and electricity. And this was intentional, as we heard several Israeli politicians say in the weeks following October 7, the blockade imposed on the journalists, and at the same time, the intense propaganda campaigns that put in question the integrity of these journalists. They've been accused of being, I'm quoting, terrorists. They've been accused of being Hamas combatants. They've been accused of many things which are completely unfounded accusations, as we've realized time and time again. But these accusations, these unfounded accusations, along with the violence, along with the blockade, they all fall under one big aim, which is really to discredit and ban information from coming out of Gaza. And unfortunately, when there is silence in Gaza, when the journalists are unable to cover what's happening, silence won't last for very long. What will come to replace this silence is disinformation. It will be fake information, wrong information that serves the interests of the political actors that are on the ground, the political and military actors that are on the ground, be it the Israeli forces or Hamas. It is very important that these journalists can continue to be our eyes and ears on the ground so that they can continue to cover and show the world what is happening in Gaza.
And Jonathan, we're talking about professional journalists here, but ordinary citizens are also becoming reporters. They're filing footage online, on social media. How do you protect people like that? They have no training. They're working on the ground as reporters just because of what's happening around them.
Well, at Reporters Without Borders, we make no difference between professional and unprofessional journalists. Citizen journalists are very common, especially in war zones, especially in places where the media infrastructure is getting destroyed and obliterated. We will often find citizens who take it upon themselves to become journalists. This is very prominent. For example, we saw this a lot during the Syrian war. We saw this in Iraq. And these citizen journalists become professional journalists, and they become some of the most important sources of information from the ground. Of course, some of the most emblematic cases in Gaza, for example, are Mu'taz Azaiza and other similar bloggers and citizen journalists. It's very important to protect them. It's very important to treat them. It's even more important to protect them, I would say, because they do not benefit from the infrastructure and the support that journalists working for big media outlets might receive. Now, even those have been facing enormous difficulties, but that allows us to imagine what the independent journalists have been going through.
Jonathan, for now, thank you so much. We do appreciate your time on the programme with us. That is Jonathan Dagher, head of the Middle East desk at Reporters Without Borders. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.